Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really gritty, defining chapter in history, how the fight for women's suffrage suddenly escalated from acts of polite lobbying into literal, undeniable violence. It's a wild story defined by a massive clash in tactics. On one side, you've got the peaceful, strategic lobbying championed by figures like Millicent Fawcett, and on the other, the militant, smash-things-up direct action spearheaded by Emmeline Pankhurst. Honestly, this history challenges almost everything we think we know about how social change actually happens.
So, here's the million-dollar question. Did violent protest actually get women the vote? It's a tough question, right? It totally challenges our modern assumptions. We're going to dig into a real debate today. Did Millicent Fawcett's peaceful suffragists move the needle, or was it Emmeline Pankhurst's militant suffragettes who finally broke the system? Let's figure it out.
To understand this crazy shift in tactics, we're going to quickly walk through the motives for having a voice, the huge political deadlock of 1910, the sudden escalation to violent protest, how World War I intervened, and finally, we'll look at how this was actually a much more fluid, united movement than people think.
All right, Section 1, Motives for Political Voice, or really, the everyday struggles.
Before we get into the bombings and the violence, we've got to ground ourselves in why winning the vote mattered so desperately to these women in the first place. You know, it's so easy for us today to view voting as just checking a box on a piece of paper. But for women of this era, it was literally a matter of basic survival. Having representation in Parliament was seen as the only real way to fix some seriously brutal everyday realities. We're talking terrible working conditions, impossibly low pay, and honestly, just a complete lack of healthcare. They knew these systemic issues would only change if they finally had a voice in the Houses of Parliament. And having that one unified goal, the vote, worked like magic to pull a super diverse group of activists together.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 1910 political deadlock, stalling in the House of Commons.
Now this is where the polite path to progress hits an absolute brick wall. It's mind-blowing how close women were to getting the national vote in 1910 before politicians got total cold feet. Believe it or not, by this time, most MPs in the House of Commons actually supported the idea. Remember, women already voted in local elections, so this was just about extending that exact same right to national politics. But the Liberal and Conservative parties just couldn't bring themselves to pull the trigger. Why? Pure, unadulterated self-preservation. They wanted to stay in power, they wanted to protect their seats, and they were absolutely terrified of what they saw as this massive unknown other. They were completely paralyzed by the fear of how millions of women might vote. So what did they do? They stalled.
Which brings us to Section 3, Escalating to Violent Protests, where frustration finally boils over.
Well, when polite politics fail, you know frustration is going to boil over. The utter failure of those political parties to act acted like a match to a powder keg for certain quarters of the suffrage movement. Just look at the timeline. The exact chronological sequence where political stalling directly triggered a massive escalation in tactics is so striking. By 1912 and 1913, guys, we aren't just talking about holding up painted signs anymore. These women engaged in really serious destructive violence. Bombing campaigns started. Timber yards were literally blown up. MPs' homes were attacked. They even left bombs on trains and in post offices. The tactics leveled up in a way that was impossible to ignore.
To give you a super specific and kind of wild example, let's talk about the Dublin attack. 3 members of the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, actually threw a hatchet into a moving carriage on a street in Dublin. While it missed its main target, it ended up nipping the ear of John Redmond, the famous Irish nationalist leader. The WSPU was taking extreme direct action. This level of violence caused massive alarm across the whole country. In fact, historians today actually still debate whether to call these highly destructive acts terrorist violence or terrorist activity. That is exactly how intense this campaign got.
And get this, they didn't even stop there. Later that exact same evening, those 3 women, totally undeterred and fiercely determined, tried to burn down a theater that Prime Minister Asquith was attending. No way, right? All 3 received long prison sentences for this relentless determination. But look, when we look back and remember the history of this social movement, it is absolutely crucial that we don't just gloss over the uncomfortable stuff. We have to acknowledge these extreme radical tactics. That leads us to Section 4, World War I intervenes. A forced pause. Just as this whole thing seemed to be totally spiraling out of control, a massive global event abruptly altered the campaign's trajectory. The First World War broke out in 1914. And in a really strange way, this sudden national emergency gave Emmeline Pankhurst an unexpected off-ramp, a chance to halt a militant campaign that was honestly losing its strategic path.
As activists themselves later admitted, the movement really was working itself into a dead end of violence. So the outbreak of war provided this necessary forced pause for everyone involved.
Now, the war fundamentally shifted the political landscape of the entire country. And here's a crazy statistic for you. Up to 40% of men in the UK in 1914 didn't even have the right to vote. Let that sink in. 40%. They were excluded simply because they didn't own property and couldn't meet the strict wealth qualifications of the time.
But the horrors of the First World War changed that moral calculus overnight. Politicians quickly realized, okay, we absolutely cannot have young men returning from the literal trenches having made the ultimate sacrifice and then tell them they still can't vote. The franchise had to be expanded. And because the landscape shifted so inevitably to enfranchise these returning soldiers, women activists were incredibly smart and effective in making sure they were also included in those new Westminster discussions.
All right, final section, number 5. A fluid, united movement, breaking the myth.
To wrap up this explainer, we really need to bust a modern myth that totally clouds how we view this era. On one side, we have the Suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, famous for militant direct action, the bombings, the hatchets, the whole shebang. On the other side, the Suffragists, led by Millicent Fawcett, dedicated entirely to peaceful, polite lobbying. Now, it's super tempting to view this as a bitter debate between two totally polarized factions, but history is rarely that neat, and framing it as a strict either-or completely misses the genius of their overarching strategy.
The reality? They were not polarized. These women knew each other. They worked side by side, and there was a massive amount of fluid movement between both camps. There was absolutely no rule saying you couldn't support peaceful suffragist lobbying one month and then go join a militant suffragette campaign the very next. Like all really rich, effective protest movements, it wasn't just one simple story. It was a diverse, complex group of activists using a huge spectrum of tactics, but all united by one highly effective goal: achieving political citizenship.
Which brings us to a really provocative final thought. When political systems completely stall out, is extreme protest the only way marginalized voices finally get heard? The biggest takeaway from this explainer is how the cowardly stalling of polite politics back in 1910 directly forged the explosive extreme tactics that followed. It really leaves us to wonder, when those in power protect themselves at the expense of the disenfranchised, how is real change actually won? Thanks so much for joining me to explore this fascinating history today.